Hayosheves Baganim, and we just gave a little introduction yesterday that it begins with this verse from Shir Hashirim, which says Hayosheves Baganim Chaverim Makshivin L'Kolech, that those who sit in gardens, or it's basically addressed to those who sit in gardens. Speaking, Hashem is speaking, addressing the Jewish people, calling us they who sit in gardens, and he says, "Friends, listen to your voice," right? And the idea is we brought a few different Perushim, Rashi, and a couple of Midrashim, but all of them kind of lead to the same point, that the friends refer to the angels for one of two reasons. Either because they're our friends, because they're B'nei Elokim Dugma Secha, because they're like us, children of God, or they're called friends because amongst themselves, they don't have any jealousy or hatred or competition, right? Either way, we who are sitting in gardens, what does it mean, gardens? Also kind of a two-pronged explanation. One says that gardens are like the gardens of the nations, basically, that we're in exile, but we find ourselves in the Beis Medrash. I think another explanation is just the garden is the Beis Medrash itself. But the idea is that when we, despite the fact that we're, exiled and sort of all over the place, we have this hiskafia, we have this good sense to come to the shul, come to the study houses, and the friends, with the ministering angels, they listen to our voice. So we sort of tapped into a connection with the previous mimer. Why? Because the idea is that even though they're in such high spiritual standing, right, the ultimate way of accessing Hashem is not with intellect. The difference between one angel and another in all the different worlds is how much they perceive God. Here we're dealing with a world of shtus, right? And God is really like imperceptible in the shtus, which is a negative, animalistic. But on the other hand, since Hashem is beyond comprehension, the only way to actually grab him is if you sort of like release and forego your comprehension, not in a negative way, but in a way which is like super rational, as we've been saying, the idea of shtus to kedusha. And what do we see when we engage in this? Even the angels are busy interested in what we're doing down here. Somehow this is like the spot, because when you kadi skafi sitra achra, when you subdue the sitra achra, which again can only really be done in this world, you reveal the sovev light. So only in our world can we reveal the sovev, the infinite light, the essential light of God. And there it dwells in the mishkan, in the physical mishkan made out of something called shtus, right? Atze shitim. So they're all eyes on us. That was the introduction, basically. So we're going to start Os Vav. You guys ready to roll? Okay. Hine beze yuvan. From here we can understand Masha Atze Mishkan Nikraim B'Shem Krashim. Why they're called by the name boards, Krashim particularly. To get us kind of stay with the Hebrew on this. That the idea is that we spoke about the name for the actual kind of wood, right? Atze shitim, coming of course from the word shtus. Now we're talking about the name for the actual boards themselves. A keresh is how you say board in Hebrew, the wooden beams. And now we can understand why they're called krashim, why they're called beams. Kamosh kesuva asises a krashim the mishkan atze shitim omdim, as the verse says in the Torah, make crushing boards for the mishkan. Atze shiti, made out of this shtus wood, ondim, standing, as opposed to, they shouldn't be lying one on top of each other, they should be standing one next to each other. Standing. Ubira inyan, why are they called crushing? Hine b'hakdamas azor be'inyan osios. So in the preface of the Zohar, when it speaks about the letters of the Jewish alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, it says like this, the alu kami kuchabrichul mibari bahu alma. The letters all came before Hashem, wanting to create wanting to stand in line that they should be chosen to create the world, right? Every letter was hoping that they would be the first one that Hashem would use to create the world. So it goes through each letter. It's a much fascinating thing, and explains like why it was or wasn't chosen. Obviously, only one was chosen, right? Bereshis bara Elokim as Hashemayim v'Haaretz. How did Hashem choose to create the world? With a base. But in the meantime, lots of letters came forward, showing their wares. Isa, and it brings there to Os Kuf Reish Asvin Dis Chaziu Al Sitra Bisha Inun, and it says that the Kuf and the Reish, they were letters that appear on the Sitra Bisha, on the bad side, right? So the Kuf and the Reish got a bad rap, and therefore they were cast aside. We begin this kaima And they're so bad. I mean, obviously, everything has a side of kedusha. These are holy Hebrew letters, but they show up on the other side. They like have a shaykhus to the Sitra Achra, and and because the Sitra Achra really doesn't have any of its own existence, right? If something is truly evil, it just sort of is not in the realm of existence at all. Hashem won't make it. So begin the iskaima, in order for them to maintain their existence, they shouldn't just negate themselves altogether. Not le oshin bagavayu have a kesher. So they grabbed the shin amongst them so that they would then spell the word, right? Kuf resh shin, or kuf shin resh, especially they took a shin between them, which the shin is in the middle of them, and it spells the word kesher. What does kesher mean? A knot to be tied on. So they basically tied themselves on to creation, to existence, by grabbing that shin, right? Bo shin isa, right? And above this, regarding the shin, right? Because these are all letters that are sort of right next to each other, right? The kuf, resh, shin are in order, right? So it says above them, in the letter shin, isa hoyel ishavu de ziyufa natan lach lemahavi imhon. So it says, since these are letters of like counterfeit letters, right? Therefore, shin, they took you to be with them, right? And because of that, lo ba'ina lemivre bach alma, and therefore shin itself was cast aside to be a creator of the world, because he allowed himself to be partners with the kuf and the resh. Don't make a world with the shin. What's that? You getting this Aramaic in there?
Yeah, it says hoyel, zufa, natzlama.
Right. So you want to get those words there?
No, just like what does that mean?
Since asvan de ziyufa, since letters of counterfeit, i.e. the resh and the kuf, not lin lach, they took you, Mr. Shin, the mahavein hon, to be with them. Lo ba, and then Hashem's talking, lo ba'in lemivri bach alma. I don't want to create with you the world, because you allowed yourself to hang around with these gangsters, the kuf and the resh.
Okay.
To begin, the lo iskaim shikra. And why? Because if I'm going to allow you, Mr. Shin, then there's also going to be something called sheker. Why? Because just like we said, the kuf and the resh wanted the shin in between them because it spells kesher, which is like their bond to reality. The shin, if you start with a shin and he hangs around with those two other guys, what does it spell? Sheker, right? So it spells kesher and it spells sheker. So since Hashem says, if I start the world with you, I know you're going to go grab your friends and we're going to have sheker. So I'm not going to make the world with you. Mikan, but from here we learn something very interesting. Man de boy lemeimar shikra, that someone who wants to say something false, yitol yisod de kshot b'kadamisa. He should take a foundation of truth to begin with, right? So we're going to say, yes, there was a God who gave the Torah to the Hebrews on Har Sinai, but then, right, you're going to make some other religion up out of it. Because if you want anyone to believe you, you have to first say something true, right? So we see from this that the Kuf and the Reish, they were liars. But if they wanted to maintain their existence, in other words, they wanted their lie to carry, they took the shin, because the shin, why? The shin we're going to see is really a letter of truth, and therefore someone who wants their lie to be established, they have to first tell some truths sprinkled around it so that it holds. Lebasa you come le shikra, and after you take a little truth at your core as your foundation, then your falsehood will stand. Daha as shin as shot ihu, because the letter of shin is independently the letter of truth. If it wasn't the fact that it hung around with these bad guys, it would be just fine. But where does the shin come, right? You have kuf, resh, shin. It's hanging out in a bad neighborhood, right? And so basically, even though it's a letter of truth, why is the shin the letter of truth? The shin's a special letter, right? Put the shin on the tefillin. The shin represents basically the three columns, right, left, and center. The shin is a good guy, but it hangs out in a bad neighborhood. And therefore we learn, if you want your sheker to stand, you should attach a shin or a letter of truth to it. At kshot da'avasan yisyachedu ba. So you are the letter of truth that they desire to unite with, right? So these bad guys are going to try and grab you so that they will have a leg to stand on. So what do we see from here? Period. That's the end. These are like a little description of why the kuf, resh, and the shin were not chosen. But it does come out, by the way, that they have some interesting letter combinations, right? One is kesher, the resh and the kuf wanted to be connected. One is sheker, because the shin can hang around in a bad neighborhood and allow falseness to stand. But one is, which we sort of didn't mention openly, but it's kind of the whole mimer is about it, is what? What's another combination of those three letters that we just discussed? I'll give you a clue. It's on the first line, right? Kesher, not kesher, keresh, right? Krushim, because we're trying to understand why the beams of the Mishkan are called krushim. Seemingly, those are a whole bunch of letters that do not belong in the Mishkan, right? All three of those letters were rejected for their negative behaviors, one way or the other. So just like we said that the Mishkan is made out of shtus, atzei shitim, which also kind of came as a great surprise. Why would you think that the singular home of the essence of Hashem in all the universes is built in a box of shtus? So not only is it atzei shitim, but it's the atzei shitim themselves are called krushim, made out of these three letters, which are in a bad neighborhood. Okay, so he says, Hine kuf reish hen leneged dalid vehei. So, on the side of the Sitra Achra, you have the Kuf and the Reish, but they correspond to the holy letters of Dalid and Hey. And why do you say that? Because they're very, very similar to each other. Sharei Reish misdame la Dalis, because the Reish looks like a Dalid. Kuf laos Hey, and the Kuf looks like a Hey. How does the Kuf look like a Hey? It's basically a Hey. Instead of like a little left leg, it has a long left leg, but otherwise exactly the same. So it's you might not have realized that, but these are mamash in their shape, even they're parallel letters, and we're going to go deeply into understanding how everything about them, the meaning. These are like the holy letters that correspond to these bad guys.
Sorry, I missed where the hay came in.
Because we're saying that the Dalid and the Hey are the flip side in Kedusha of the Reish and the Kuf. The Dalid and the Reish are almost exactly the same.
Right.
And the Hey and the Kuf are almost exactly the same.
How are the hay and the kuf?
Because when you make a Kuf, you basically make like a Dalid, right?
Yeah,
Or a Reish, and then you make a long leg instead of a short leg, right? On the left side.
Oh.
But other than that, it's the same exact letter.
Got it.
Right? The Dalid V'Reish, let's start one at a time. We're going to go into it more. But Dalid V'Reish, do you have a copy? You want a copy? We have an extra one here. Hine domim zeh lezeh. The Dalid and the Reish are compared to each other.
Mine is like cut off, but it's right here.
What page are we on? We're on page Tes. In Os Vav, in the very middle, and there's a period 2 words in. All right, so actually, yeah. So he says the Dalid V'Reish hine domim zelazeh, b'demusan v'kein b'peirushan. The Dalid and the Reish are very similar to each other, not only in, as we said a second ago, what they look like, the demus, their image, but also in their meaning. In other words, what does that mean? Does the Dalid have a meaning? Does the Reish have a meaning? Yes. Unlike other languages, where the letters don't really have an independent meaning, right? A, B, C. There's no like meaning to A, B, or C. In Hebrew, very interestingly, every letter is actually a word, right? And there's parts of the letter which don't seem to even be associated with that letter at all. Like an aleph suddenly has a lamed and a pei inside of the spelling of an aleph, which is, what do they have? A lamed and a pei have to do with anything, right? A base has a yud and a taf. So there's every letter is actually a little word. So the idea is that Reish and Dalid actually mean the same thing as well. Reish, right? He says Dalid, humilashon dalus. First word, the word Dalid comes from the word poor. Dalus means to be poor, but anius, poverty. Ubesfiros usfiros hamalchus teleis la migar maklum. And then also this letter has a sphera that it represents. In general, just as a point there, the spheros are not letters, usually, right? In other words, there's 10 spheros and there's 22 letters which connect them. But we spoke about this at another time. Nonetheless, the letters themselves are symbols that relate to, they're huge contractions, like sort of shorthand, trying to express things that are above them. So for example, sometimes we say the yud is like chokhmah, not to say that chokhmah is a yud. Yud is a mere letter, but it's a small letter, right? And it's just a point, and it's the beginning of every letter. You make a yud first, so it like has characteristics of the sphere of chokhmah, right? Like in a contracted letter form. So the same thing here. When we're saying that Dalid is Malchus, we're saying that the letter Dalid represents Malchus, not that it actually is the sphere of Malchus. But why is Dalid Malchus, right? Because the sphere of Malchus also represents the word poor. Why is Malchus poor? We said Leis le megar maklum. What do those words mean? Leis la megar maklum.
Like it doesn't even have any bones.
It doesn't have any
Bones.
that's
Form.
cute.
Form.
It doesn't have anything to it at all.
I think garma also means just itself, right? So it's basically saying it doesn't have anything of itself. I like that though. Garma definitely is called bones, but I think basically it doesn't have any of her own, right? Meaning to say, what is Malchus? It's really the kli, right? Which receives all the lights from above it. So there's really 9 spheros, up until and not including Malchus. And Malchus is basically just a receptacle of those spheros. On one hand, it sort of plays 2 roles. It catches the spheros, and then it distributes them to the world below. So sometimes, therefore, we call the Malchus like the moon, right? The spheres above it are called the sun. Malchus is sometimes called the moon. Why? Because just like the moon, she doesn't have any of her own light. She just reflects the light of the sun. So even though she can sometimes be full and a luminary in the sky, it's not her own light. And therefore she's called poor, right? Because she doesn't have anything of her own. So too the Dalid, the word Dalid means poor. And that's also one of the reasons why it represents the sphere of Malchus, which is called poor, right? Now that's in spheros. What about in kochos? In other words, everything in the spheros also is a sort of anthropomorphic reality inside of our own human lives. So in the kochos, what does Malchus represent inside of our own soul powers? Anyone know? Yes, but kochos hanefesh, when it comes to the powers of the soul of the man, who koach hadibor, it's called the power of speech. Why is it called the power of speech? Because it all goes to the same place, right? Speech in a person is also called poor. Why? Because it's a faculty which does not have any of its own stuff. It just basically collects whatever was in your intelligence, whatever is in your emotions, whatever is in your thoughts, and it basically just, amplifies them and sends them out. So your faculty of speech doesn't actually invent anything. It doesn't have like intelligence in that way. It's just like a carrier, like the moon. So therefore it's called poor. So in general, Malchus is associated with speech. And therefore the Dalit, which is called poor, it's called Malchus, also associated with speech. She mekabeles v'levush lakocha shelamayim malamayla mimena. Right? That speech receives and is a garment for the powers that are above it. Right? It's like, what does it mean, a garment? So for example, I might have an emotion, I'm feeling love. I'm going to garb that love in some letters of speech, which is going to be, those letters are going to receive the emotion, garb it, and then sort of be able to send it on its way. He says, for example, what is it going to garb? Any influence from your intelligence and from your emotions. The powers that are above speech. So that's the Dalit. And how are we saying that's Reish-like? Very much. Kain os Reish, humilashan anios v'dalus. The word Reish, believe it or not, also means poor. Right? As it says in Mishle, he quotes that, right, Mechisas dalim Reishim. Right, that basically you have this idea, and here you have Dalim Reishim together. There's like the destruction of the poor and the poor, right? Or I guess you could say maybe the translation is not that. The translation is Mechisas Dalim Reisham, right? That the wicked, the destruction of the poor is their poverty. But you see that the word Reish and Dalis together, poor, poverty, are basically having the same exact meaning. Also, there's another pasuk. It says reish v'osher. Literally, it says poor and rich, and it's reish yud shin, just like that. Exactly the way the letter is spelled. So the word reish also means poor. So that's interesting. There's two letters which basically look and mean almost exactly the same thing. Now, even though Dalet and Reish are equal in their meaning, they're really totally separate and divided in their, so to speak, inyan. In other words, it's like a borrowed external reality that they happen to look the same and mean the same thing. Because in truth, they couldn't be more opposite. Right? They're totally different in their inyan, what they really represent. So much so, there's special halachas that are in place, literally in the law books, regarding those two letters. Does anyone know what they are? There's laws governing the usage of the dalet and the reish. And it says, Kasher yachlif ha-reish b'makom ha-dalis, that if, God forbid, I say God forbid because it's a serious crime, you would switch a reish in a place where it's supposed to be a dalet, or put a dalet b'makom ha-reish, harizeh machriv olamos chas v'shalom. You're called a destroyer of worlds. They're that different from each other that if you switch them around inside of verses in the Torah, you are called destroyer of worlds. Why? Because it says, "Kamo kol hamarich be'echad," right? Marichim lo yamav v'shnosav. It says, for example, in the Shema, right? You know, in the halachas of the Shema, it says you're supposed to sort of meditate on the word echad, and it says anyone who lengthens the dalid in echad, right, his years and his days are lengthened. In other words, it's like a segula for long life, right? Because you're basically meditating on the meaning of the dalid, which we're not going to go into now, but it has all kinds of, we just said it's malchus and all kinds of interesting things. You know, it's a large dalet in the Shema. It's bigger than the other letters, whatever. That's a whole world of Hasidus to look into, but that's not our topic right now. But anyone who sort of meditates and even verbally lengthens the dalet, how do you do that? Really like the Taimanis sort of have the capital like a monopoly on that because they pronounce like a soft dalet, which is like a the sound. But for us, it's hard to lengthen the dalet. It's just like a punctual sound. But nonetheless, if you lengthen the dalet, whether it's in thought or in speech, you lengthen your years and days. As long as you emphasize it to dalet. But it says in the halacha, if you would chas v'shalom trade it in for the dalet for a reish, machriv olamos, you're called a destroyer of worlds. Why would that be? It's kind of simple, but
Because the acher instead of echad.
right. God forbid. I don't even want to say it. You're saying the exact opposite of the declaration of our faith in the one God. Right? If you switch the dalet with the reish and the word echad, it becomes the word acher. And what are you saying? God forbid. You don't even want to say it. Right? So you see that one letter switching specifically that letter, the dalet to the reish, it has the exact opposite meaning, and it's called destroyer of worlds. Also, there's another place where it says lo tishtachave lekel acher, and also there in the Torah there's the letters also big, the reish, which means do not bow down to other gods, right? And again, the letter reish there is big in the Torah, just like the dalet is big in the word echad and Shema, because it's coming to tell you don't mess this one up.
Right.
Because if you put the reish and exchange it for a dalet, it would mean don't bow down to the one God. So you see that these two letters are like mamish opposing each other in their very essence, even though they're so similar. They mean the same thing. They look almost exactly the same. And there, tzrich ladgish os reish. There you must pronounce the reish with an extra gusto. Ve'im machlifim. And if you switch it, chas v'shalom b'dalet with a dalet, again, harizeh machriv olamos. You're called destroyer of worlds. Don't be a destroyer of worlds. Dangerous. Hainu, which means to say, Degam, the reish v'dalet domi b'tmunasum perusham. We're turning the page, whoever's following along inside. That even though the dalet and the reish are very comparable, both in their picture and their meaning, they actually, nevertheless, are as distant from each other as they could possibly be. To the point that they're like polar opposites and aggressively against each other. Trading them in is called a world destroyer. Hainu de os dales hu bekedusha. Vos reish hu me'asvin dis chaziu al sitra bisha. And why is that? Because the letter dalid is sort of like a symbol of kedusha, right? That's the idea, is that we said it represents malchus, okay? And malchus is actually, in a certain sense, like another name for malchus really is Knesset Yisrael, and it's sort of like the moon. The Jewish people are compared to the moon. It's a symbol of kedusha, where we already said that the letter Reish is one of those letters that the Zohar said shows up on the Sitra Achret, shows up on the bad side, right? So you have it's basically the difference between kedusha and klippa, right in the letters. Again, we're going to ultimately explain how in the Mishkan, right, there's no dalid in the word keresh. So we're not saying that these letters are intrinsically bad. On the contrary, potentially these darker letters have even a higher level of kedusha if used properly. So we're not like saying that there's certain letters in the alphabet which are just intrinsically bad, but they show up on the dark side. That's sort of their leaning. Just like we said, that the dalid represents malchus. Like it's just a symbol for something. It's a symbol for something in kedusha. Where the reish, the kuf, the shin, right? The shin, because of its association with the reish and the kuf, they're symbols for something negative, right? Obviously, they can be turned around. What is the difference between these two letters, really? But munasam, there is a slight difference in the way they look. Hu de os dalid har yeshlo yud ma'acharav, and that is on the letter dalid. There is a little yud sticking off the back of it, right? So when you make a dalid, the top line sticks a little bit over to the right of the vertical line, right? And therefore there's a little piece sticking off the end of the back of the yud of the dalid, and that's a yud, that's the letter yud, yeah.
So is what you're saying basically that these letters are from Klipas Noga, so to speak, because
I'm saying the letters are from Kedusha, right? All the letters,
but they show up in bad?
Yeah, all the letters are Kedusha, right? Like, where are the source of the letters, right? You have the 10 spheres and the 22 letters, and all that is in Atzilus. So like the first presentation of any of these letters is they are in Kedusha. But Hashem then uses these letters to express different aspects. And certain letters are used to symbolize Klippa. And that's basically what we're saying. We're not saying that the letter itself is Klippa, right? We're saying that Hashem uses certain letters, almost just like you would say, like the angel of death itself is not Klippa, right? It's like a messenger of Hashem to do certain things. So certain letters are employed by Hashem to take care of an aspect of his creation which conceals him. Doesn't mean that they themselves are actually Klippa. They're the holy letters of the Jewish alphabet, but that's what he's using them for.
So then nothing's really Klipa. Is there anything that's really Klipa if everything is just like a messenger?
Ultimately not, because look, these are, let's say, like the bad guys on the letters, right? And where do they find themselves in the end of the day? In the Keresh, right? They find themselves in the Mishkan. The whole idea is that nothing is really Klippa, and the function that Hashem made all this Klippa is so that we Jews in this world filled with Klippa, Male Klippas, right? It says that this world, it said the Arizal is brought in Tanya, is filled with Klippas, and the wicked are dominant here. Hashem sent us into this place so that we would take this shtus and dafka make it back into holiness, and then it's not only just regular holiness, it's the pinnacle of holiness, right? So at the end of the day, nothing is really Klippa, nothing really conceals Hashem. It's just serving that role temporarily until a Jew comes around and uses it for the right thing. And that's actually why it was made, because the transformation of something from darkness to light is actually releases even a higher level of Kedusha. So Hashem set us up with this job to do. In any case, so we're saying, what's the difference between how they look? That this Dalid has a little Yud sticking off the edge of it, right? On the back of it. The Os Yud, Mora al Bittul, Vaziras Garma, right? Because the letter Yud represents Bittul, and so to speak, there's the word Garma again, it refers to self, right? And it means Azira, like Ze'er, right? It means to make yourself small. So the letter Yud is also definitely one of the holy letters, right? Because it's mamish one of the letters in Hashem's name. And it's not only that, but it's the letter which represents Chokhmah. What's the idea of Chokhmah? Is essentially not taking up any space. When you take up space, you're like an affront to Hashem, right? Regarding an arrogant person, Hashem says, Ein ani v'hu yechol lador b'makom echad. I and you cannot dwell in the same place. In other words, if you want to take up this space, like Gesundheit, you can be there by yourself. But if you want me to be in that space, if you want to make a place for Hashem, you have to remove yourself, remove your will, remove your sense of self and arrogance. So that act of self-removal is the Yud, because the Yud is the smallest letter, and it basically makes itself small, so it represents Kedusha. Right? And the fact that the Dalit has that Yud sticking onto the end of it shows a certain holiness and purity in the Dalit itself. Right? We see that the Dalit shows up with nice neighbors, right? The word Yehuda, it says, is basically just the word Yud K Vav K with the Dalit inside of it. Right? And this is sort of like again, Yehuda represents Malchus, the kingship. So it's like the humility that's associated with the name of Hashem. So this is the Dalit has going for it. Behind Malchus Datzilus to Leis La Migar Maklum. And again, that's why the Dalit represents Malchus, because that's Malchus's like number one capability, is that it makes itself into nothing, right? That's why it's able to reflect the light of God, right? If you're like sort of puffing yourself up, then you're not able to shine the light of God through you. You're blocking it. So the whole idea of Malchus is that it's basically it goes into a state of nothingness. It's trying to negate itself, right? And therefore, the Dalit represents this level of Malchus because it has this Yud on it, which is making itself small all the time.
Wait, because it has a Yud on it? Oh.
Yeah, the Yud is like a make yourself small letter. It's the idea of Kedusha is like, removing your sense of self. And that's why the Dalit, because it has that Yud, it's making itself small, and therefore Malchus is able to be a Kli, right?
So it's a Reish, but it's a Reish which makes itself small?
Yes.
So then what's a Reish?
It's a Reish that doesn't make itself small. We're going to see some. It's basically we're going to see in a second, it's poverty without the bittul, right? So it's a kind of perverted type of poverty. We're going to see exactly in a second, right? And why does Malchus have nothing of her own? Because she makes herself into a nothing. She's like a total receiver. Okay. Bezeu de Malchus datzilus naisen nekuda tachas hayesod. And this is the idea that when we say Malchus of Atzilus becomes a point under Yesod. What is this referring to? It's a Kabbalistic concept, right? That all the spheros are sort of, they flesh themselves out, right, into a full-blown partsuf. Like each one is a bit of like a rainbow that has all the other ones inside. And since the idea of each sphera is to express itself, in other words, these are the lights of Hashem, which are coming to sort of give him definition, personality, description. They're not a nothing. Their function is not to be a nothing. Light, in a certain sense, of course, every light has a certain bittul, because its job is just to shine from the source of light, but it's a shining something, right? It's bringing something to light. It's showing you what it is, right? And so therefore, the spheres above Malchus, they're expressed not as a point, right? Because a point is something which basically shows on an absence of expression. So they're sort of like a demonstration of expression. But the sphere of Malchus is called a point underneath Yesod, because its job is not to show you what it has. Its job is to be like a hole, right, which allows everything else to come into it. V'hainu bittul v'anachas atzmusa, which is the notion of negation and putting itself on the side, legabi shari spheros, in before all the other spheros, because it's really its job, just like speech. Right? If your speech had like a mind of its own, and it just like wanted to talk about what it wanted to talk about, whatever that means, then all of your intellect and your emotions that you wanted to express, they wouldn't be able to come out, because your dumb mouth is saying its own conversation, right? Thank God it doesn't usually work like that. But the idea is that no, on the contrary, there is no such thing as speech on its own, right? It's just there to accept whatever's put into it. It makes itself into like a nothing and just is an automatic conveyor of everything above it. This is what Malchus is. It puts itself aside completely for the other spheros. And because of that, it becomes a vessel to receive. As the statement goes, right? That a profound statement from our sages. And it says, a empty vessel will hold whatever liquid, whatever you're putting inside of it. A full vessel will not hold. Like I was saying before about speech, right? Or before what I was saying about Hashem and you cannot dwell in the same place. Right? If you want to hold Hashem, then you can't be full of yourself, right? So, and if you are full of yourself, you're not going to hold anything, right? A full vessel can't hold anymore. So if you want to hold something which is above you, you have to empty yourself out. You have to be vacant in your own right. The kamah makabel, just like a receiver, in order to be a vessel that actually receives. It's only when you're in a state of absolute negation and sort of like lowliness in your own person. Lowliness not in a negative sense, but just like you don't like pride yourself on any of your own accomplishments at that moment. Because the second as you're going to see, the second you're going to try to sort of like have your own idea or present your own sense of self, not necessarily even a bad thing, at that moment you can't simultaneously receive, right? If you're projecting anything at all, you're not going to be able to receive, right? So it's a state of absolute like simplicity and lowliness.
So, but there's a state of giving also, meaning Malchus has a state of giving also.
On the contrary, if you think about it that way, Malchus is the king. He's like the master of all, right? But in terms of who? The one who's below him, right? So your speech also, right? In other words, I don't know anything about you if you didn't have your speech, right? I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't know if you're intelligent. I don't know if you're a fool. I don't know if you're compassionate or stingy. I don't know anything. It's only from your speech. So on the one hand, it's like the reveal all and like the ultimate dominant force, but it's only because it's a receiver, right? So just like the king of Israel or something like that, right? Why do we give him all this kavod, right? Because he, if he's doing his job right, is the most bittul, right? It's like the Rebbe, like he's the king. Like you come into the Rebbe and you like it, bow down. Like this is like a situation where he has all the control. But why? Because you know that he sees himself as a nothing before Hashem, and he's just a receiver from like divinity 24/7. And because he's so bittul, therefore he receives and then he expresses, just like speech. Speech is on one hand absolutely negation before everything that's above it in your powers of your soul, but on the other hand, it's the great revealer, right? It's the one. It's total. It's revelation itself. So on that hand, it depends the role that it's playing. And Malchus, as you may know, plays two roles in the spheros, right? What are the two roles Malchus plays? It's either Malchus or it's Kesser, right? Now Kesser is the ultimate giver. It's the mashpia even beyond chokhmah, right? Everything, even the reishis chokhmah, even the beginning receives from Kesser. So it depends what role Malchus is playing, right? And like I said before, if you're going to like sort of, if Malchus is not going to be a proper receiver, then for sure there's nothing to give because she doesn't have anything of her own. And that's the problem. When someone's going to try to be a giver and like present themselves as though they have something when they're not actually receiving it from above, that's basically what we're dealing with is the reish. They have nothing. They're empty, right? You have people that like prop themselves up as though they have something going on, but since they're not really humble and not really receiving anything, it's like it's an act, really. And unfortunately, not only are they not rich, they're exceedingly poor, right? And because whatever they do have, it's not connected to the source. And so it's just like some finite external reality of a show, which is actually completely inept when it comes to the source of the real flow, as we're going to soon see regarding the reish. In any case, this is Malchus. This is the Dalit. It has this bittul, and therefore it's a receiver. The Az, only when you're in a state of total shiflus, lowliness, like no sense of of self. As hu kli lekabel misas hashpas harav. Only then could you actually receive the true shefa from the Rav. So now we're talking, let's say, like you're at it for bringing with the Rebbe, right? And you want to actually take in everything that the Rebbe is there to offer. It's like mamash, it's like you're standing at mamash the Oel Moed. Moshe Rabbeinu is going to say a few words. These words are going to ultimately be recorded in mamash the Chumash, right? And you're there, and you want to take it all in. How do you do it? He says, "Ein ze maspikadai and masha talmid einum bechinas yeshu metzias." It's not enough that you just aren't an arrogant person, right? In other words, I showed up. I'm not like mamash, like hanging out with Dasan and Avira. I'm in the back, doing whatever, right? It's not enough. Kim dafka kasher bechinas bitul vehedra metzias. You have to come into that situation with a state of total negation and absence of self. It reminds me of a very profound moment in my life when I was just married and I was living in Sfat, and I came in to the Rebbe for Tishrei, right? And it's like a thing. I'm going to Rebbe for Tishrei. People travel like half of Sfat, the big yeshiva, they all go in there. And
go where?
They go to 770, right? And they have Tishrei with the Rebbe, There's an Indian in general that this concept of like Ola L'Regel, that you're supposed to go to Jerusalem for the 3 festivals. The Zohar says in the time of exile, you're supposed to go to your Rebbe for the festivals, right? So I went, and I bumped into this like super chassid at a Fabringen as soon as I got there. It was like a few weeks early. And this like comes to mind because I was like, he's like, what are you doing here? I was like, I come to the Rebbe for Tishrei. And he's like, you come to the Rebbe for Tishrei. He's like, you just like get on a plane and come, like you think that's what it's all about. He's like, when we would go prepare ourselves to see the Rebbe, like we would have to like do something to ourselves. You're about to stand in front of Moshe Rabbeinu in like a yechida situation. You can't just like knock on the door and come in as you are. You have to basically prepare yourself, put my marim in your head, like do tshuva, take on like a new matzias in yourself. You're about to mamash experience divinity. You can't just come as you are. Even if your person that you are is not like an arrogant person. But you have to negate yourself. That's what he said to me. It totally like freaked me out and changed my life forever. But this is what he's saying. When you come to, and by the way, this particular person, you can see him in videos at Fabrengens. And you can see him because he looks different than every single other person in the pictures around him. He's mamish listening with like an intensity that you can see in a photograph 50 years later. Anyway, it's a real thing, And so he's saying that when you're going to go stand before the Oel Moed, you want to receive from the Rebbe, it's not enough just not to be a yesh, not to be arrogant. You have to put yourself in an absence of existence. And the more that you contract yourself and like remove your sense of identity with your bittul and just sort of like a empty vessel to receive, that's then the more and more and more you can receive. In other words, not everyone's going to go into that for bringing and get the same thing. And that's what he was trying to tell me. You're going to the Rebbe. Like, you want to go to the Rebbe, you have to go somewhere first in yourself so that the Rebbe can come to you, right? There's so much there. You better get yourself ready to experience all this. And in order to do that, you have to work at removing yourself. He says there's a very simple example for this, right? Which is, so to speak, the preparation in your power of movement when you want to lift up a particular load. A little load, a little cup, you don't need to prepare yourself, you just roll in there. So if I want to go see some other rabbi, he's going to say a Devar Torah, it doesn't require that much, it's not such a big load, I can handle it. Umasa kaveda, but if you're going to get a big load, like you're going to see mamish elokus, beguf gashmi, the more you're going to sort of prepare yourself in this lifting, right? You see like weightlifters, they have like a whole like routine before they come pick something up. Then you could pick up a very, very much bigger load. So if you're trying to really, truly receive mamish from a true sage, you can't just roll in there as you are. You have to prepare yourself to receive this experience. And the preparation is making yourself into a yud. like losing your sense of identity, all your thoughts, the way you, like your attitudes about reality. Like, what if you're prepared for your mind to be changed, right? You don't have the light. You're going to receive the light. You could receive a revelation the world's never seen before. But if you're busy thinking you know how things are, it's going to be very difficult for you. This is one of the things they say, that it's easier, so to speak, for the Rebbe to makarev non-religious Jews than it is for him to makarev people who are on some kind of a derech, right? Like a Litvish derech, or this derech, or that derech, because they have a strong derech in Torah. They also had rabbis. They also understand the world. So Yosef HaTzadik is going to come with dreams and a new derech in Avodas Hashem. They're not a kli for it. Not because they're not yidden with a capability of humbling themselves. It's because they watched all these videos of some rabbi on YouTube, and they have all crazy ideas in their head about how things are, right? And therefore, by the time when they come and hear Mamash Emes, they don't want to hear any MS because they got it already, right? They know. So it's a problem. You can't. They're blocked. And this basically happens to all of us, really in any time we talk to any other Jew, if you think about it. Because every Jew, if you could truly just listen to him, you would have a completely experience than the way that you normally interact with people. That's what they said. Not only the Rebbe was giving over Torah, at the dais over there, but even when you would go into a room with him, you would experience this overwhelming sense that this person really knows me, this person really cares about me. This is like a standard thing that you hear from everybody, because he was doing that when you wanted to talk, right? He would basically prepare himself to just experience the whole you, and you're your soul is bare before him because he's accepting you, right? It's the only person that can really trust, in a sense, because everybody else, when you want advice from them, they already have a head full of advice they gave to the guy before, that it's sort of tailor-made, and it doesn't apply to you because they have stuff in their head already. To be truly empty and experience somebody else is really a high level thing to do. Whether it's the Rebbe doing that for you or you doing that for the Rebbe or any Jew. He says, "V'zeu lo timtza b'gasi haruach." You will not find this ability in an arrogant person. V'lo b'misha marchi b'leil libo kiyam. Not someone whose heart is as wide as the sea. V'gasi haruach hu she'ein lo bittul. This that we call a thick, thick-spirited person. It's a person who doesn't have bittul. He's a know-it-all. And therefore he's really not relevant to receive a Dvar Torah. We're going to hold here, but we definitely all know people that you want to express to them the glory of the Torah, and explain to them why they should realize the sensitivity of what they're dealing with, the holy letters, and they just came out of some kind of a postmodern feminist class, and they got nothing. There's nothing there for you, right? There's no opening, because they know already. So if you don't release yourself and accept something, you're basically blocked from experience anything, and this is called the lack of bittul. So this is fortunately what the Dalid does not suffer from, and we'll pick it up tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem.
Wow, that's great.